It's world's number 2 against world's number 3 in round 10 of the FIDE Grand Swiss on the Isle of Man. It's Hikaru Nakamura playing with the white pieces against Fabiano Caruana. And it's a very important game for Hikaru. There are only 2 candidate spots to be made here in this tournament. So Hikaru needs to play for a win. For Fabiano, the situation is somewhat different because he had a fantastic performance at the World Cup earlier this year. So he is already qualified. Normally, these 2 players, you would expect maybe a very solid game, a very even game. But this game brings us a lot of fireworks. So let's have a look. Make sure to subscribe to the channel as we are going to cover this spectacular game as well as the final round. Let's have a look. Hikaru goes for e4. And after e5, knight f3, we see the Petrov defense. And that's interesting because in my previous video, you could see that Hikaru faced this opening also in the previous round against Ivan Cheparinov. And in that game, he went for the main line with the move knight takes e5. But this time, he decides to go for the move knight c3. And that's a very clever opening choice. And why it's so clever? Well, you don't know what these top players are gonna play. And Fabiano often also goes for, instead of the Petrov, for the move knight c6. And the Scotch 4 knights, which is what we get to see in the game, can also be reached by this move order. After knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4. This is the so-called Scotch 4 knights. It's a solid opening. A lot of games have ended in a draw in this particular variation, but you get some sort of a game, and there are not that many forcing variations. So interesting choice. Bishop b4, knight takes c6, pawn takes, bishop d3, d5, pawn takes, both sides castle. This is all very well-known theory. Black recaptures the pawn, white goes for the move h3. And that's a very important line, which was back in 2012 made popularized by Vladimir Kramnik. And it's an interesting choice. It has the idea to get a queen to f3 without getting bothered by bishop g4 idea. So here the big question is, how is black going to develop its pieces and how to place its pawns in the center? So one of the main moves here is to play c6 to overprotect the pawn on d5. Fabi has a different idea. He goes for bishop e6, and now after queen f3, black goes for the move c5. It's a somewhat more aggressive continuation. These 2 pawns, they look quite nice here. And sometimes there are ideas for black to advance the pawn to c4 so that the bishop has to make a decision. But here, white goes for rook d1. That's a good idea. c4 is not a possibility here as the pawn will just be captured thanks to this pin. So instead of playing the move c4, black goes for bishop takes c3, trading off the bishop for the knight with the idea to create isolated double pawns on the queen side. But black is surrendering the pair of bishops. It's an open position, so who knows what white is capable to do here with these pieces. Queen a5 played, and the bishop goes to g5. So the queen, of course, is looking at this pawn weakness on c3. But look, this pawn cannot be captured yet. It runs into bishop takes h7 because the queen on c3 will just be hanging in that case. White is winning the queen. So here Fabi instead goes for the move knight to e4. He is aiming for simplifications. After bishop takes e4, d takes e4, it's possible to take the pawn on e4, but after queen takes c3, the position looks very even. And instead, look what Hikaru is doing now. He's not going to take the pawn on e4, but he played the move queen to g3. And that's a very interesting, ambitious move. Because if you look at the pawn formation, white has double pawns, black has an extra pawn on the e-file. It looks as if black should be better for that reason. But there are also dynamical factors which need to be taken into account. And with the move queen to g3, white is intending to go bishop to h6, attacking the pawn on g7. The pawn cannot capture the bishop because of that queen on g3. If the pawn goes to g6, the rook on f8 will be hanging. So bishop h6 is a huge threat. Therefore, the black king goes into the corner. White moves the pawn away from a2 to a4. Maybe that's a little surprise, but the idea is that later the rook will be able to move. Rook fe8. Rook is better placed on the e-file, supporting that pawn later on. Note that this bishop on g5 covers the d8 square, so black is unable to contest that open file. And white, look what Hikaru is going to do now, comes in with the rook to d6. So white has ideas to double maybe, or at least to put more pressure by entering with a rook. Very important moment, as black needs to decide how to proceed. And I think something like f6 is recommendable to chase this bishop away. Maybe at some point you can play something like rook a8. It looks quite reasonable. But instead they followed the move h6. Also chasing the bishop away, but the bishop comes to f4. And let's have a look what's going to happen here, because this bishop is not badly placed at all. There are ideas sometimes to bring the bishop to e5 and create new threats against that pawn on g7. Rook e7 was played, and I think there are various interesting moves here. In the game, queen e3 was played, but it should be said that something like rook e1 is just incredibly strong, bringing the last piece into the game. Let me show you one key idea. If you do take the pawn on a4, which is possible now, the rook no longer protects that pawn, there's the idea to sacrifice the bishop on h6. A very unexpected tactic, may have been overlooked by both players. The point is that if you take the bishop, it's queen h4 with a double attack. You don't want to lose the rook. If the rook goes away, you take on h6, king g8, and now you see the difference with the rook on e1 coming to e3. There's a rook lift, and black is going to be checkmated very soon. Of course, the pawn on a4 doesn't have to be taken, but otherwise, white even has ideas to take the pawn himself on e4. So I like rook e1. Queen e3 is also a very interesting move with some clear ideas. Look, queen and bishop are looking at that pawn on h6. Rook c8 was played, and now Hikaru striking here with the move bishop takes h6. That's a very nice move. Even stronger probably would have been to play bishop e5 to have two pieces working on a diagonal towards the black king, because the pawn on g7 is pinned. White is threatening to take on h6 with the queen. The pawn cannot recapture because of the pin. If you play f6, there's another tactic. Bishop takes f6, g takes, queen takes h6. You have already two pawns. You're capturing with check. You can even capture another pawn. So the attack is looking really strong. Instead, bishop takes h6 was played, which is also very nice. Let me show you what happens if you take the bishop. G takes h6, queen takes, king g8, queen g5 check, double attack. King gotta go to f8, and now the key move here is queen f6. Maybe this was overlooked by Fabi in his calculations. The idea is queen h8 is a mating threat here. Even if you try to run away with the king, that doesn't make a difference because the rook covers the d-file. The king cannot escape via the center. The king also got to keep the rook defended, so only move is rook e to e8. But now rook takes e6, beautiful tactic. Black cannot take back with the pawn. If you take with the rook, then you pick up the rook on c8. And, well, white is just completely winning here because the king is too exposed. The rook will come very quickly to d1, and the attack is still going on. Instead of taking the bishop, Fabi played here the move f6. So he basically said, okay, I cannot do much about it. I cannot take your bishop. Let me try to defend this position. But Hikaru takes a second pawn. Queen takes e4. If you take on h6, it's rook takes e6. And, well, black's king is just wide open. This is a free attack with a number of extra pawns. So after queen takes e4, Fabi goes for queen takes c3. Hits the rook on a1. Now the rook comes into the game, doubling on the d-file. And there are ideas, of course, to give a check on d8, for instance. Rook c to e8 and rook d8 played anyway. The rook is on its way to remove the defenders. And note that this bishop on h6 can still not be taken. This is a very instructive line. Now white's idea would have been to take on e8. Black recaptures, queen g6, double attack. Rook goes away, queen takes h6 check, king g8, give another check. Are you going to repeat the moves? No way. We once again bring the rook into the attack, attacking the queen at the same time. After queen e1, king h2, there's no convenient defense. The rook will come to g3. If you ever go rook g8, it's queen h6 with checkmate right away. This is just completely winning for white. So no time to capture that bishop, and instead bishop g8 was played. So black is trying to consolidate its king's position, attacking the queen. But the queen goes away. It goes to h4. Interesting move. Maybe queen g6 was also very strong according to the engine. But I like queen h4. I think queen h4 is even a more human continuation, as you would like to oppose the king on this h-file. And still, the bishop cannot be taken. This is so important because you take on e8 once again. And then you take on h6. Now the bishop can block on h7. But the rook will come into the 7th rank with deadly mating threats. If you do give a check here on e1, king h2, you have this possibility to play rook e7 to guard the 7th rank. But now it's queen f8, and after bishop blocks, you can just capture another pawn, and on the next move, you will take the rook. So in all these lines, you have to calculate a little bit, but white can justify this bishop sacrifice. It still cannot be taken. Queen takes c2 was played. So now the idea is that if you try to make this cover check with your bishop, the queen comes back into defense. That's not what you want to allow. So rook 1 to d3. That's a very important idea to make sure that the queen, the black queen, cannot get back into defense. Bishop h7 was played to attack the rook. And now the rook goes to d7. So the trick is that the bishop no longer guarding the 8th rank, and the queen is no longer able to come to h7 because the bishop is occupying that square. Here again, bishop cannot be taken because of queen takes f6, check. If the king goes away, you take the rook, and it's checkmate on g7. So many brilliant attacking lines. Fabi, play the move g5, attacks the queen, queen goes away to g3. Now it looks as if this bishop is just trapped, but the idea is that if black tries to attack it with the move queen g6, there is rook takes e7, black takes the rook on d8, and now bishop to g7 check. And here black has a big problem. You have to give up the queen on g7 for the bishop and rook, but that's completely lost, of course. After king g8, the point there is queen to b3, and it's going to be checkmate just within a couple of moves. The king cannot go anywhere. So there are a lot of problems. And look at this nice tension between the rooks. If you take one rook, white captures the other one. Queen b1 check played, king h2, queen f5 coming back, trying to maybe give up the queen for getting two rooks. But now white captures on e7, rook takes d8, and now the queen comes in to c7, attacking the rook. And this is very, very nice. The idea is that if the rook goes away, let's say it goes to c8 with tempo to attack the queen, there's another beautiful tactic. With rook e8, you're sacrificing the rook, but you're clearing the 7th rank. After rook takes e8, it's queen g7 with checkmate. Fantastic line. Therefore, this is not possible. It's a double attack, in fact. You're attacking the rook and you're threatening rook e8. Black doesn't have anything better, but give a check on f4, forcing white to go for the exchange of queens. But after bishop g7, king g8, bishop takes f6, the end game is just really, really bad. First of all, white is a pawn up. Bishop goes away, and now it's rook g7. You have a big problem with your king. If you go into the corner, you just capture the pawn. And next, the rook will be taken. So king gotta go to f8. Now there are various moves. You can take the pawn on a7, but Hikaru shows very good technique. He has seen very well that you can just liquidate into a winning opposite colored bishop endgame. Bishop takes d8, king takes g7. The bishop attacks the pawn on f4. So if that happens, you're able to win a third pawn on the king side. I mean, the c pawn is not going to be dangerous at all. We will see that very soon. Black tried to move f3, hoping that maybe white would take the pawn and split its pawns on the king side. But it's better to keep your pawns connected. c4, king g3, so white is attacking the pawn on f3, bishop e4, and now the bishop went back to d2. And here, Fabi had seen enough. He knows that this endgame is just completely winning. Maybe not for you, so let me show you what is the idea here. After king f7, you bring the king to f4, attack the bishop, bishop goes away. You can save your pawn, that's not needed, but let's keep it simple. King to g7, now you bring up your pawns, they are really strong. King f7, black cannot really do anything. You bring up your pawns there. Black is just going to wait. And now the bishop is on c3. It had been guarding the c3 square for a long time. But now the pawn is definitely blocked. And we see that the bishop has a double function. It's stopping the pawn, but at the same time, it's also supporting the advance of the pawns on the king side. If king goes away, you play g6, and later you're gonna play h6 followed by h7, and black is unable to remain control over these dark squares. So white won this crucial game, and that means that Hikaru is still in the lead now with two other players, with Andrei Esipenko and FIDE, and that's going to be very interesting. And only two players will qualify for the candidates. They have different opponents. They are not playing against each other, but this is going to be a very, very exciting and probably a dramatic final round of this FIDE Grand Swiss. I hope you'll come back for the next video. So stay tuned for more action and, of course, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for doing that. See you soon. Bye-bye.